Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside. That's from an old Emerson, Lake and Palmer song. And we'll be weaving in and out of cultural phenomena that touched my life while we talk about Swift. And if you watched the last video, you saw that we talked about transitioning from Interface Builder to SwiftUI, and I think we gave you a pretty good overview. Again, the method for me is to immerse you into SwiftUI without covering all the little details that you probably don't need to know right away. I want you to get a feel for Swift UI. Immersion is the best way to learn things, and so we're going to keep diving into Swift UI. And what are user interfaces generally used for? Well, it's a user interface. It's a way to bridge the gap between the program, the hardware, and the user. And the user usually expresses that interaction by passing data to the program. So how does SwiftUI capture data? And let's look at that from its simplest level. Another good reason to use SwiftUI is the fact that it's a paradigm that supports 5 platforms instead of just one. I mean, you can do UI development in iOS, iPadOS, macOS, watchOS, and tvOS. And SwiftUI is also totally compatible with UIKit and AppKit. So you can mix and match. It's early on. I haven't been able to do any pan-platform apps yet, but it is an enticing idea. At least I can see myself doing some basic building blocks, maybe like the company logo across all platforms, starting with something like that. But I diverge. Let's build UI with SwiftUI. But when we build a UI, generally there's a user interface going on, right? That's the whole point of a user interface, SwiftUI. The user has to interact with the app and the hardware in order for the app and the hardware to do something. I mean, whether it's passively through a heart rate monitor or that the user is tapping and typing in a dollar amount that he or she wants to send across the network to a friend, there has to be data entry. And when there's data entry, the concept of state becomes important because has the user entered any data yet? Is the data entered valid? Has the user changed the data they've entered? Does the app have the data it needs to fulfill its declared purpose? When the user updates data, are those changes reflected consistently throughout the user interface? Why don't we start out with adding some state variables to make this budding login form come to life. So we're going to go up here into our content view struct, and we're going to start with this keyword for state, and we'll call a variable username, and we'll initialize it to an empty string. And then we'll have another state variable called password, and we'll initialize that to a blank string. And finally, we'll have a state var called login status. And we'll just call it status. For now. Oh, gee. I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to start some coding. But we do have to talk about a few things, like this state modifier here. When the value, like username, changes, SwiftUI updates the parts of the view hierarchy that depend on this value of username. And Apple specifically states that you should use state as the single source of truth for a given value stored in a view hierarchy. Now, in a view hierarchy, I mean, I guess that would be some entity in which you have a struct that inherits from this content view here. If you're talking about a view hierarchy, then yes, this state would then be, how should I say, the single source of truth. That's something I got to think about, but be that as it may, to emphasize the fact that we are adhering to the Swift principle of local reasoning, why don't we go ahead and make all these variable declarations private? And that way, we're pretty confident that that data isn't going to leak out and contaminate other views in our user interface. Um, we can always pull out those private keywords, I guess, if we have to, but I've seen this a lot, and I believe Apple has said something about it, although I couldn't find it while making this video. So we'll just leave an asterisk by that and come back to it later. So let's get rid of all this simple show me code here in the VStack and start over. So we're going to do a login form like we were. We had a mock-up. Let's make one that actually works. So for the username, we don't want a read-only text. We want a text field. And we'll give that a name, username here, just like we did before. And then we'll give it the text. See how this says binding string? That means that this text field for username is bound to what else? Username. But because it's a binding, we're going to use a special syntax preceded by a $sign, and we're going to say user name. Now, bear with me. Remember that $sign, because we'll show you an example of a place where you might say, well, why isn't there a $sign there to show the relationship between, say, the user interface element of TextField and the variable that holds the username that's stored and typed into that text field. So we need a text field for password. So we're going to do something almost exactly the same here. Text field, and we'll say password here, and then we'll say text. Again, this is a binding. And we're going to bind this text field to this password variable. And you see what we're doing here. Since a text field can be interacted with by the user, they can enter text, they can backspace, they can delete, they can cut, copy, and paste pieces of text out of that text field. We definitely want a binding so that while the user changes data, if and probably we do want to reflect changes immediately in the rest of the user interface, we have that binding so that the user sees immediately that something's changing while they're making changes. That dynamic, interactive feedback to the user is always very helpful. So previously we had a label, and we're going to do the same thing again, though instead of hard coding the label, we're going to use the login status. And again, this system image, remember, we can leave as blank, and it just won't show an image. Now, you might say, why are the username and password fields left justified? Well, I mean, SwiftUI is smart, but it's not that smart, and we need to have some kind of base alignment for a text field so that we can place it somewhere on screen quickly and easily. And remember that even in UIKit and AppKit, a text field can always be multi-line, not just single line. So what the SwiftUI developers have done is they've added a modifier to TextField that allows us to set in the general area where we want the username and the password text fields to reside. And the modifier is what's called a multi-line text alignment, And then the alignment, we can just do dot center for short. And look what you got. You've got the username centered. For the password, we just do the same thing again. Multi-line text alignment dot center, and they're centered, and we have a status. And the last thing we need is our login button, which is going to be really easy. So let's just do button with a title and an action. For the title, of course, this is a login form. The action, let's double click this to get a closure, and let's just say login status equal logged in, exclamation point. Now, how does that look to you guys? So right now, if I go over to the preview here and I hit login, it's going to tell me logged in, because all I'm doing for the action here is assigning, remember, again, one of our state variables, I'm changing it from the word status to logged in. And notice we're not using a binding here because, well, we don't have to. We've got the actual variable and we can assign something to it. But why don't we make this rather silly, simple login button just a little more thoughtful and give you an idea of what you can do with SwiftUI. Why don't we say if username not equal nothing and password not equal to empty string, close bracket, and we'll go down here and we'll close bracket, and then we'll say else login status equals login failed. Now, why don't we go ahead and run that? Okay, so we'll say my username is A Jaffe. Oh, Schaefer, okay. My username is Schaefer. And we'll say that my password is secret. I can't spell. And then we'll say login. And since both the username and the password were filled in, we got the positive case of this if statement. In other words, if the username and the password were not filled in, which is not really security, but I just want to show you that you can put code inside your SwiftUI. Now, what you're seeing and you might be concerned with, what if I have all this user interface code with then logic mixed in with it? Then what happens to my MVC model or my MVVM model? I mean, it looks like I should probably be abstracting like a button action to a function call in some utility class or login class in another file. Anyway, I think you guys have gotten a good start and a good look at an introduction to SwiftUI, and I hope I've helped you make the transition from interface builder and auto layout to SwiftUI. Please come back soon because we're just scratched the surface on SwiftUI. There's a lot more videos to come. Please join me. I'd really like to have you here. Thank you so much.